Welcome to ESG in Practice, where we turn environmental, social, and governance topics into practical, actionable steps.
I'm Anne, your guide to data-driven sustainability insights.
And I'm Abby, with 2 decades of hands-on experience in this field.
Together with our guests, we're unraveling the complexities of ESG, where we move the discussion away from glossary reporting
to make sustainability and compliance a real competitive advantage for your business.
Hello, everyone. Together here with us is Tormod Tingstad. Hello, Tormod.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Abby, do you want to introduce to our guests how you know Tormod?
I would be happy to. Just before we hit record, Tormod and I realized we've known each other for 15 years. Tormod was the person who hired me into Yara, where we set up the Ethics and Compliance Department together in 2009. Tormod, I know a lot about you, but maybe our listeners don't. Can you share a little bit about your background, what you did before you became one of the first chief compliance officers in Norway, and what did you do after that role too?
I've done a lot of things in my career, which I think reflects my personality. To a great extent, I'm curious and I'm impatient, like to do new things. In brief, I'm a lawyer from Norway. I started out as a lawyer in a law practice in doing commercial and civil law, shipping law actually. Moved on to work for Norsk Hydro, which was a dream for me at that time. I had various positions at Norsk Hydro. I was an in-house lawyer and a company secretary. I was country manager in Sweden and Denmark for a while. And then I was stationed in Asia for a few years. I quit Hydro, which at that time had become Yara, as far as my job was concerned, because Yara was, of course, spun out of Hydro, worked for another Norwegian company in Singapore, and came back as a chief compliance officer at Yara in 2009. That's when we met.
Yes, I was the first hire into your team.
You were the first hire. I hired you against advice of the recruiter.
And I always appreciate that, I must say.
Because they wanted me to hire a Norwegian man. I'm very happy I hired you, Abby. We had a great run together.
No, I really appreciate you taking a chance on me. And every other role, I would say, in Norway, I've met through my network. But definitely at Yara, you opened the doors for me there for the career I can have. So I really appreciate that.
And just so I have it clear, this is one of the first ethics and compliance programs in Norway, right?
Yeah, maybe I should say a few words about that, because that's quite interesting. And I think we were at a unique junction, the development of compliance in Norway, because I was hired back to the company. Yara had been through a lot. At that time, they got a new CEO and wanted to start with a new compliance agenda.
What was also happening at that time was Siemens. Siemens was having this global corruption charge. And there's a lot of attention around this, more than it had ever been before, I think. And that's where CEOs and some of the management team started thinking like, oh, what am I doing in this area?
It was a fantastic starting position because we got the resources we needed. I was basically given a carte blanche to do what I wanted, which was amazing. And the first thing I did was to hire you and to man up the compliance department. I left the company in 2013, but since then, working for Hydro and Yara has actually been a benchmark in my life too. It was an amazing international company that gave you lots of responsibilities, lots of opportunities. The highlight was obviously for us and our department was to develop the compliance program. Frankly, I think we did a pretty good job considering how early compliance was in its evolution at that time. And it really gave us the space to explore what would be the best solutions, how to put together what we thought could be a best practice compliance program. That has been a foundation in my compliance journey since, I think, in many ways.
Can you say what you did after?
I left Yara in 2013. I went to Denmark to head up a new forensics department, first at EY. EY bought over KPMG. I became partner at KPMG Denmark, worked on compliance there for a couple of years, heading up the forensics department. I worked for a law firm who is Solicitor General in Denmark until 2021. At the end of COVID, I felt it was time to start thinking about getting home to Norway and my own tribe. That's when I got back. I'm a partner at Elden, which is a large law firm. We are mostly known for working in the criminal defense area. We have a lot of criminal cases, certainly here in this district, but all over Norway. I work only with white-collar crime defense work or more investigations, compliance work.
And you do have a side gig that you've been doing also from Denmark, and that's around a compliance school.
I realized when preparing for this session here today how much I actually love compliance, but I do, and I particularly like to talk about it, teach it, and discuss it. When I was in Denmark, after I left KPMG, it dawned on me while I was trying to work as a consultant in this area in Denmark that Denmark was not as advanced as Norway. They were still lagging a bit behind in compliance work. So I started this compliance school, which is basically just a school to teach new compliance professionals basic compliance skills, like what is compliance? How do you go about to create a compliance program and so forth?
And then you brought that to Norway too.
Yeah, and then we've done that one round ground here in Norway, and we look at rolling it out again with hardcore compliance education, traditional corporate compliance, but also we're looking at exploring to move it more into the ESG space as well.
We do see there's a combination of sustainability and compliance moving into the ESG sector together.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm curious though, how do you start about setting up a compliance program? You mentioned when you started at Yara, it was your responsibility to make every decision on how this program will be set up, which will have implications on how the company adopts that program. How do you do it basically?
I clearly remember that I moved back from Singapore to Oslo to take this position. I got into my new office on the management floor of Yara. I sat down at my desk and I was really just looking at my computer screen wondering, how do I do this? The thought had struck me before. What is actually a compliance program? We Googled 15 years back as well. And I did all kinds of research I could online to try to figure out. I was sure there had to be some consultants that could help me do this, either in Norway or abroad. I quickly realized there was no consultant that could help me, and there was no cookbook who told me how to put together a compliance program. That was basically trying to drill down and putting it together, not entirely ourselves, but that was what we did. Abby was part of that too.
Yeah,
So
no, I remember there were some networks and we were looking into the UK and the US because there wasn't so much in Norway that we could compare ourselves against. And we were trying to figure out the templates. And there's the standard things, training, whistleblowing hotline, investigations that you would have. I think that's been one of my thoughts, that it's been 15 years now. So how do we actually move even further than those typical things? And sometimes in our industry, we're still stuck at that training, policy, investigation aspect of it.
The elements haven't changed very much. I think at that time in 2009-10, we had UK Bribery Act coming, which that's true. Gave a good starting point.
That came out in 2012. There's a lot of companies trying to figure out how is the UK regulation going to affect compliance, anti-bribery and corruption within corporations. I wanted to tag on to En's question. What is a compliance officer? What is that role? How would you even describe a compliance officer in a company, and what are their responsibilities?
That will obviously vary hugely from company to company. It's very different to be a compliance officer at Telenor or Hydro or Yara than in a smaller company. I meet a lot of compliance officers from small companies when I teach or talk to people out there. Being a compliance officer in a big company, you get a function within the greater compliance context. Yeah. You're responsible for learning or tools or for the program or for investigations. Being a compliance officer in a smaller company or being alone as a compliance officer is a different game altogether, I think. Firstly, a lot of compliance officers still in Norway and surely in other countries, both in Europe and beyond, are not just a compliance officer. They're the compliance officer and legal officer. In Denmark, I know a person who's the compliance officer and HR officer. That's a fairly large-sized company. So it depends on the resources and the structure of the company, but a compliance officer should be the professional entity within a company that is the steward of the ethics and compliance program on a professional level. As a compliance officer, you're not responsible for compliance in your company, but you're responsible for the program that is making it happen, that facilitates it. And you're an advisor to management on compliance and ethics issues. That's how I see it, but it can vary greatly. Also, some compliance officers are responsible for the whole menu of compliance issues, while others are split between the legal department and the compliance department. So the legal department is, for instance, responsible for competition, GDPR, and more legal issues like that.
Compliance is really interesting because it's been around for a long time, at least 15 years in Norway. It's also now getting more attention because of the whole ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Usually the sustainability officer is responsible for the E, and then the S seems to be up for grabs between compliance and sustainability. The G function is very much compliance. It's another way of saying compliance within the organization. One of my thoughts is around the independence of a compliance officer. For me, if it's done correctly, compliance officer is one of the most independent roles within an organization.
I agree. It should be, certainly, but it's an inherent conflict in the role because you are part of the organization. You are part of the hierarchy of the organization. Some compliance officers have a dotted line to an audit committee, but you're still part of an organization and the lines that exist within that structure. At the same time, the issues you are supposed to have an opinion about are issues of integrity, issues of ethics, what you think is right and wrong. It can be tremendously important and decisive issues for the company as well as for the people it concerns or the decision concerns. And it's decisions and values that are not measurable as we are used to it. It can't be made into kilos or meters or grams or money. The compliance officer, and this might not be unique just for the compliance officer, but I think the compliance compliance officer, more than other corporate functions or functions within a company, is making really hard discretionary calls of great importance. If you compromise them, it gets back to you as a person. It's not just your professional view or your view on a statute, how it should be interpreted. It's who you are that are at stake for many people. And frankly, it should be.
I think a lot of people who end up being compliance officers, they want to do good in the world because they are the stewards of ethics and compliance and making sure that your company competes fairly, that it doesn't do anything bad for long-term reputation, that it protects their employees. Oftentimes, people think that compliance officers are the police. They're to get you in trouble or they're trying to slow down business. That's definitely a change in how compliance officers should be seen because they're actually there to protect the business. And sometimes they have to make these hard decisions to be like, no, maybe we need to slow down and maybe we shouldn't have this sale. But it's a very tough position when you're the only one or you're in this independent function. In the past, it's been hard to measure what is a compliance officer doing. And I think that's something that we've been trying to change with Fortify and also with the ESG regulations that coming in. How do you quantify this invisible work of a compliance officer so that it can be measured, you can have oversight over it, and it can be reported? But I think this is an evolution and the maturity of the compliance field.
Absolutely. I'm not here to promote the compliance school, but that's also what my ambition has been, basically, to make compliance into a profession, like being an internal auditor or being a lawyer or an accountant, or to really have a more formal or structured content of that role.
Within finance or, like you said, internal audit, it's quite clear. But within compliance, is it anti-bribery and corruption? Or is it investigations? Is it risk management? Is it third-party management? Is it all of these different areas? And oftentimes a compliance officer is pulled between all of these areas, not able to cover one fully or have oversight of another one. And also based on your background, if you come from a police background, you're more likely to focus on investigations. And if you come from a law background, you might focus on different policies. How do you even the playing field to make sure you're covering all the right topics?
To that complexity, that it's also topics that many people have an opinion about. What is corruption, or what is right, or what is wrong, what is harassment, or what is... A lot of people love to talk about that.
Yeah.
Not least managers, corporate leaders. Some of the decisions you have to make or contribute to can have tremendous impact both within the organization but also on the business of the organization. So it's a lot of stake of.
Absolutely. And that's a lot of pressure for a compliance officer to be that person that has to say that thing that maybe we should slow down. I think most compliance officers probably have been yelled at once or twice in their career. It can be a lonely role. I think it's so important because of that independence. Compliance is more independent than even HR within the organization if set up correctly. They're there to protect the company and the employees.
Tormod, you said earlier that the compliance officer is responsible for setting up the ethics and compliance program in the company and making sure that it's implemented. But my question is, how do you know that it's working? How do you track that?
First of all, there are many tools to measure. You can do feedback, you can do surveys. Today, companies do a lot of feedback work, internal surveys. The proof of the pudding is also people trust the management to go out and ask, do you feel you work for an ethical company? Do you believe you work for a company that is actively taking a stance against anti-corruption? Do you think you work at a company that actually cares about harassment and protection of minorities? Is that something that the company just brings about when it suits them for political or marketing purposes? That's probably the best way of measuring it.
You're starting to see with the regulations that they're expecting some kind of quantitative or qualitative measure on that. That's where the change is happening. And people are still struggling. How do we measure the effectiveness of a compliance program? Because in the past, it's like, how many trainings did you give? But how do you know if people actually absorb the training that you give? And we had another podcast guest was talking a lot about this. The challenge the compliance departments or compliance teams are facing now is how do you show the worth of what you're doing? And I think that a lot of companies are figuring that out. We're working with customers to help them identify these metrics so that they're able to report on them according to the regulation. This is an interesting data-centric shift around compliance. We're in the beginning stages, so it's really interesting to see that evolution.
Obviously, it's extremely helpful with all these reporting requirements can seem tedious and unnecessary and just focus on ticking the box. First of all, it forces companies to do some serious work. It creates transparency and accountability. The results, we must assume that they are valid to some degree and not just window dressing. So that's been a welcome development, I think.
How is it being a lawyer compared to a compliance officer?
I was about to say it's easier because you only have to opine on the law. What do you think the outcome of a legal dispute or situation will be? As a compliance officer, I really feel that it really relates to more core values within yourself. It really relates to your integrity. And I think that is the tiring, exhausting part in one way, but it's also the interesting part. It's the rewarding part because you can contribute, you can make things change, you can affect the way your company does business, hopefully in a better, fairer, more transparent way. Being a compliance officer, and this is not just based on my personal personal experience, but also the experience of many people I know. It's a really tough job. People often don't last too long because it's so all-consuming, for many at least. And I think it's a bit of a dilemma because it should be. I think the people who take it too lightly, who just go by the book, check the procedures, the checklists, they're not really compliance officers in the sense I would like them to be, at least. They get the job done and they probably experience fewer conflicts and discussions along the way. But I think it's a profession that demands that you bring your whole value set into it. And that can be tiring.
Yeah, I'm very much about separating the function. Sometimes it's like, what does the law say? If the law in the country allows for child labor, is that okay? Versus a compliance officer might say, okay, you don't always want to go to the minimum of the law of the country. You have set an ethical standard at the group level. We want to prevent child labor in our operations. So you take a step higher in that, and you have that ethical morality that you're trying to solve for this. It's often easy to fall behind on the law and be like, well, it's okay here. And I think that's where companies have come into trouble because laws have changed. And also, there's an expectation that you're not going to go to the lowest common denominator. You're going to actually try to be an ethical company and go a little bit harder. So maybe it's legal to do this sale this way, but how is this going to look in the company? What you're going to do in your marketing or within your organization? It comes down when the rubber hits the road and you have to make a decision on this. That's where it's very difficult. Are you going to match what you said publicly, or are you going to do something that's legal but not exactly ethical, right? That's a challenge.
And even more than a challenge, I think the legal department and the compliance department can look like they have parallel, harmonious, complementing roles. But it's the opposite, I think. The legal department should challenge the legal environment, should look for every opportunity, also within the law that the company has. That's the obligation of a legal department, I think, to be proactive and progressive in taking legal risks. While the compliance department has that other, it's kind of checks and balances, that other function, which is not legalistic at all. I mean, it's not a legal profession to be in compliance. It shouldn't be, at least.
Yeah, there's a lot of lawyers in compliance, but it is, like you said, a different mindset.
It's a lot of law that forms the basis for the compliance work, but it's about a lot of other considerations and norm sets as well.
Tormod, I think compliance officers has been a not so well-known field in itself. People think of it as a police. I've been in this situation where I've asked to have a coffee chat and people are just so scared. Like, what did I do wrong? I don't even want to talk to you. There's an unfortunate view of compliance officers. Now with ESG, environmental, social, and governance really covering the compliance aspect of an organization, the role is getting more, I would say, visibility within the organization. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this change and the relationship between sustainability and compliance.
I think ESG is a very welcome concept for compliance people. In the beginning, we had CSR. It is the precursor to ESG. And CSR was definitely soft law. It was defined as what you did beyond your obligation according to law, which meant that it was placed within marketing department, not really any obligations or serious management matters. You should never mix this CSR concept with compliance because compliance is hardcore. That's really your license to operate. So I've been skeptical to the whole ESG agenda until it materialized over the last few years in the EU directive. I think it's a tremendously welcome addition because, first of all, obviously you have to see the three components together. It's part of the broader societal accountability any company should take on and live up to. But I also think that we have fought for so long now for compliance, anti-corruption, more hardcore. It has gotten us a little bit further. It's really disappointing how little has changed, how little we have been able to change the world, so to speak, when you look at, for instance, the Global Perceptions Index. The rate of corruption is basically the same.
From 15 years ago.
The world is not going in the right direction in many ways. We need that extra push the E and S agenda can give us because the E and S agenda are much more palatable, understandable for most people. People do care about the environment, about animals, fresh air, fresh water, because it affects them directly. Corruption in Africa doesn't really relate to many people in their daily life. We don't like child laborers. We want our products to be produced by people who get proper pay. That's something people can relate to. And I think now it's kind of the G that's actually tagging a bit on to those.
Absolutely.
That used to be more soft law. And I think it makes it easier sell almost. So that has been a positive development.
And actually that's a good point. And I think what we've seen is like it's easier to measure some things around, especially actually E, if you think about carbon and the number and the carbon intensity. And then S, you have some they're trying to figure out, but you have DEI statistics, health and safety statistics, and there's some other ones around human rights that are being. I think G has been harder to measure. Of course, you have your whistleblowing hotline and you have your training. But now I think there's a growing movement, and that's something that we're trying to also push, is how do you quantify that to make it easier to see the impact that you're having? One thing that we're realizing from working with our customers is that it's almost a bad thing that compliance has been around for a long time, because you have 15 years of manual file folders of information that is just sitting there that was not digitalized and not used, because this was before low code, no code, the invention and all the AI that's coming within the last few years. So you're sitting on 15 years of just file folders and data that you're not actually using to be able to have oversight or have the risk.
I was surprised to learn in the compliance world, it seemed to never have gotten that digitalization attention. It was just left to the side and not invited to play with the rest of the departments. I'm curious, Tormod, how do you think it would have helped you, for example, when you started your compliance journey, if you had access to this data-driven approaches and real-time insights?
I think that would have been, of course, a huge help to have some tools. For me, it's really important to say that compliance is about people, it's about the environment, it's the air we breathe, it's about people who work for us, it's about how we relate to the outside world. It's a very human area in many ways, so it touches human and often unquantifiable metrics. It will always make it hard-ish, at least, to make it entirely data-driven, at least in a traditional sense. But a combination of data, or data that I could both use and that could guide me through my work.
I don't think we can replace compliance officers with AI or with data, but I do believe that data can help drive the effectiveness or oversight of a compliance officer to take those personal conversations based off of the data that you see. Having worked in the sector for now a very long time, compliance officers are often reactive. Burning fires are coming. They're hit from so many different spaces, and it's very hard to think strategically long term. And then you're running from one issue to another issue, and then you're losing track of where you are or what you should be doing. That's been my experience when we were able to have a more data-driven approach in my last few companies. Then you know where to allocate your time or where the risks are, and then you can take that personal step towards it. But there has been a negative stigma around compliance officers, so that's why they haven't made the digitalization or that transformation. IT, HR, and finance have been closer to the business. That's also a challenge with compliance officers. In being so reactive, oftentimes you miss the oversight of what you're trying to do, like understanding the actual business. The compliance school that you do is very helpful in trying to get the attention of what should you be focusing your time on, and then how do you also not get into the state of fight or flight that often compliance officers are. They're feeling already lonely, they don't know where to go, and they're just putting out fires. I'd love to get your thoughts on that reactive feeling of compliance officers.
That's one of the biggest challenges, particularly new compliance officers that I sometimes meet. They get into a position and they have all the opportunities that we described for Yara when we started the compliance program there in 2009. You have access to resources and so forth, but you get into your office and you're being hit by requests. And you never get or issues or dilemmas or consultants who wants to help you.
Yeah.
You try to grasp what this is all about. You go to lots of seminars and get more and more confused and the solution because it seems overwhelming. You're never really able to lift your ambition and to look up and try to formulate more a strategic ambition. That strategic ambition doesn't have to be so lofty or so ambitious. It has to be something tangible that you can be measured against, that brings you from point A where you are today to what the company wants to do with your function. A topic which you guys know much more about than me, which is AI, will obviously help us to identify how to focus and how to prioritize in a whole totally new way than we did 15 years ago, when it was just guesswork, basically, what we focused on. Which topics were included in a compliance program were a bit based on what we think is.
One thing that I learned midway through my career is you get into a role and then suddenly you're hit with all of these reactive things, but you don't take time to really understand the business and the people who are in the front lines. Yeah. That is something that I learned probably a little bit too late in my career, working from the headquarters and not being down in the field. Suddenly I was in Microsoft and I was in the field. It took me 2 years into my Microsoft role because I was putting out fires and audits and all of these different things and dashboards and metrics I needed to follow up, was to actually sit down and talk with the business. I had set up these 30-minute coffee chats with a lot of people throughout the business. That was very eye-opening because you could read the financial reports, you could think you understand the business, you could think you understand the challenges, but when you talk to the people on the ground, then you realize, oh, I'm not even focusing on the right risks because they're actually dealing with something that I never even thought possible. It hasn't come through my dashboards, come through what I've come across. I did that also in my last role. When I joined, I met with over 40 general managers around the global company right when I began because of my experience from Microsoft, and people thought I was crazy. Why are are you going to have 40 meetings in this short time? But just having those short meetings, I got so much insight into the risk and the challenges within the organization. That would be maybe a tip for newer compliance officers. Take time to get to know the business. Don't react to put out every fire, but take time, 15, 20 minutes to truly understand the business and the people you're working with. And at that time, you'll also make a network across the business that you might need help later on. And you can tap into them because they actually know who you are, not a scary compliance officer, police officer sitting in the back corner.
You create ambassadors, basically, who will help promote you and the work you're trying to do. I thought I knew the business because I'd been with a company for a long time. I knew a lot of people within the business. I had some operational experience, but I didn't realize how complex the whole stakeholder was. I thought that this person just doesn't get it, or I was probably a bit arrogant sometimes because I really felt I knew this after a while. To dive even a bit deeper than just meeting people, but trying to really analyze the stakeholder map, to really take it in what position other people who are purchaser for this, what the complexity of issues take into consideration. It's not so straightforward as it often seems from a client's.
Sometimes with any corporate function, and I recognize this too from working at Yara, where we're in the headquarters and we're working on this topic day and night, to moving to a subsidiary in Microsoft where suddenly compliance wasn't so many different topics coming from the headquarters at once relating to compliance, and how do you manage all of these moving pieces from a subsidiary level. And it made me realize that I could have done things better when I was in the headquarters that I wouldn't have understood until you've sat in the subsidiaries and you see how things land.
That also relates to another issue that I think I've learned through experience, and that which probably a lot of people learn through their careers, is that don't strive for absolute perfection. There is no perfection, at least not in this area. Be prepared to compromise, even when it really hurts. You need to compromise sometimes. Doing the right thing might mean different things to different people, and you might not always be in a position to make that call, and just face up to that. Being in a big organization is teamwork, after all.
With so many things changing around ESG, sustainability, and compliance, I would love to get your thoughts on the evolution of the compliance role. Where would you like to see it going?
We live in quite dark, stark times.
Yeah.
The world is not having its heyday right now. Democracies are challenged with war in Europe, with the whole Middle Eastern Palestinian conflict. I think we are at a junction, at a crossing, at a point in time, and certainly in my lifetime, where it's really important which decisions we make. And of course, that realization could lead us to a dark place. But I'm really so optimistic when I look around on social media, like TikTok and things like that, with younger people, how activistic younger people and relentlessly younger people, I think on all sides of the political spectrum, they demand transparency and accountability in a militant way that my generation didn't do. We are much more respectful to established structures and systems and media and all of that. So I really think the whole ESG agenda will become so much more important in the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I absolutely see. And I just even see that in education with my kids. And in school, they're talking about these topics that we never really had as subjects in our school. And they're really growing up with and understanding the impact of sustainability. The future looks bright there. We just need to figure out how to harness it.
Should we move to the rapid fire questions?
One word to describe the future of ESG.
Optimistic.
Biggest misconception about ESG?
That it's a new thing, that it's soft law, it's not soft law.
What's your go-to metrics for ESG success?
To make a plan.
Biggest challenge in ESG implementation?
Prioritizing.
What's the most underrated aspect of ESG?
Impact of ESG or non-ESG, if there is such a word, could be to your business, could you have on your business.
ESG in one sentence?
A huge potential.
Why is ESG implementation more important than ESG reporting?
As always in life, it's much more important what you do than what you say.
Very good. Thank you, Tormod.
I'll laugh more next time.